The morning mist clung to the shores of Lake Winnipeg like a shroud, its grey tendrils weaving between the cattails and wild rice that swayed in the September breeze. It was the kind of morning that made the world feel suspended between seasons, summer's warmth still lingering in the soil, autumn's promise whispering through the maple leaves that had just begun their transformation from green to gold. Ayana Sinclair stood at the edge of the Peguis First Nation, her long black hair catching the pale sunlight as she adjusted the hand-woven scarf around her shoulders. The scarf was a gift from her grandmother, traditional colors of deep red, earth brown, and sky blue interwoven with symbols that told stories older than the town itself. Her grandmother, Margaret, had spent countless evenings by the fire, her weathered hands working the wool with the patience of someone who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. "Nuko always said this scarf would protect me," Ayana had told her best friend Kendra just the week before. The Ojibwe word for grandmother rolled off her tongue with the familiarity of home, carrying with it generations of love and wisdom. She wove prayers into every thread. At 17, Ayana moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. She was a senior at the local high school, president of the Indigenous Student Association, and spent her weekends helping at the community center, teaching traditional beadwork to younger children. Her teachers often spoke of her potential, how she could be anything she wanted to be, go anywhere she chose. But Ayana never wavered in her conviction that her future lay here among her people, helping to bridge the gap between tradition and the modern world that seemed to press against their community with increasing urgency. The Peguis First Nation in 2004 was a community caught between worlds. Cell phone towers stood like modern totem poles against the horizon, while traditional tipis still graced the landscape during ceremony times. Young people downloaded music on their computers, while elders shared stories that had been passed down through oral tradition for centuries. Ayana navigated these waters with remarkable grace, equally comfortable discussing her college applications and the significance of the upcoming harvest ceremony. That Tuesday morning, September 14, 2004, began like any other. Ayana's mother, Linda, watched from the kitchen window as her daughter walked toward the main road, her school bag slung over one shoulder, that treasured scarf a splash of color against her dark jacket. Linda had offered to drive her to school, as she did most mornings, but Ayana had smiled and shaken her head. "I want to walk today, Mom. The air feels different, like change is coming." Those would be the last words Linda Sinclair would hear her daughter speak. The walk from the Sinclair home to the school was approximately 2 kilometers along Highway 7, a stretch of road that cut through a landscape of rolling farmland and scattered woods. It was a route Ayana had taken hundreds of times, a path so familiar she could navigate it with her eyes closed. The highway wasn't busy, mostly local traffic, the occasional truck hauling grain from the surrounding farms, and the school buses that would begin their routes within the hour. Other students had seen her that morning. Marcus Beardy, a classmate who lived closer to town, remembered passing her in his older brother's pickup truck around 7:45 a.m. She had waved, that characteristic wave of hers, enthusiastic and warm, as if she was genuinely happy to see everyone she encountered. Marcus later told police that she seemed perfectly normal, walking at her usual pace, her scarf bright against the grey morning sky. Sarah McKinnon, who ran the small convenience store where the highway intersected with the reservation's main access road, recalled seeing a young Indigenous woman walking past her store around the same time. "She was beautiful," Sarah would later tell investigators. "You couldn't miss that scarf. It was like a piece of art walking down the road." But somewhere between Sarah's store and the high school, in a stretch of road bordered by dense poplar woods and abandoned farmland, Ayana Sinclair simply vanished. When she didn't appear for first period English, a class she had never missed, her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, made a note but wasn't immediately concerned. Sometimes students overslept, sometimes family emergencies arose. But when Ayana missed her second period, and then her third, Mrs. Patterson walked to the main office and asked them to call home. Linda Sinclair answered on the first ring. She left for school this morning right on time, she told the secretary, her voice already carrying the thin edge of worry that every parent recognizes. She was walking, said she wanted to walk today. By noon, when Ayana had missed half the school day, Linda was driving slowly along Highway 7, her heart hammering against her ribs as she scanned the ditches, the tree line, anywhere her daughter might be. She stopped at Sarah's store, her hands shaking as she described Ayana to the clerk. "Oh yes, the girl with the beautiful scarf," Sarah confirmed. "I saw her this morning, maybe around 7:45. She was walking toward town, looked perfectly fine." The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were contacted at 2:30 p.m. when it became clear that Ayana had not simply skipped school or gone somewhere without permission. This was a young woman who called home if she was going to be 15 minutes late, who had never given her parents a moment's trouble, who carried the responsibility of being a role model for younger community members with grace and seriousness. Constable Derek Morrison took the initial report, his pen moving across the form with practiced efficiency. Missing Indigenous woman, 17 years old. Last seen walking to school. The statistics were grim. Indigenous women in Canada went missing at rates far exceeding those of non-Indigenous women, and the outcomes were often tragic. But Morrison had known the Sinclair family for years, had watched Ayana grow up, had seen her speak at community events with poise beyond her years. "We'll find her," he promised Linda, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "She's a smart girl. She'll turn up." But as the hours stretched into evening and evening deepened into night, it became clear that this was not a case of a teenager acting impulsively or rebelliously. This was something else entirely. The search began at dawn on September 15th. Volunteers from the Peguis First Nation, neighboring communities and the surrounding towns converged on the area where Ayana was last seen. They walked in lines through the poplar woods, calling her name until their voices grew hoarse. They searched abandoned buildings, culverts, anywhere a person might take shelter or be hidden. Search and rescue teams brought in dogs, hoping to catch a scent that might lead them to answers. If stories like these move you to reflect on the mysteries that shape our communities, we share them, because sometimes the questions that haunt us most are the ones that teach us the most about hope, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us all. The dogs found nothing, the searchers found nothing. It was as if Ayana Sinclair had simply stepped off the edge of the world, leaving behind only questions and a community grappling with a grief that had no focal point, no closure, no understanding. As September faded into October and October surrendered to the harsh Manitoba winter, the search efforts gradually diminished. The case remained open, but active investigation slowed to a crawl. Linda Sinclair continued to drive Highway 7 every morning, her eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of her daughter, any clue that might explain what had happened to the girl who had walked into the morning mist wearing her grandmother's scarf and never returned. The Peguis First Nation, a community that had endured generations of trauma and loss, now carried another wound, the absence of a young woman who had represented their hopes for the future, who had been a bridge between past and present, tradition and progress. Her empty chair at the kitchen table, her unused graduation cap still hanging in her bedroom closet, her voice absent from the community center, where she had taught children to honor their heritage through beadwork and stories. Margaret Sinclair, Ayana's grandmother, the woman who had woven prayers into every thread of that treasured scarf, aged visibly in the months following her granddaughter's disappearance. She would sit by her window, her hands still moving with muscle memory as she worked on beadwork or weaving, but her eyes would drift to the road, watching, always watching, for a figure that would never appear on the horizon. In the months that followed, investigators would interview dozens of people, chase numerous leads, and exhaust every conventional avenue of inquiry. But Ayanna Sinclair had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind only the echo of her laughter, the memory of her dreams, and the enduring mystery of what had happened on that misty September morning when change truly did come to the shores of Lake Winnipeg. The war room at the RCMP detachment in Selkirk looked like a shrine to questions without answers. By October 2004, the walls were papered with maps, photographs, timelines, and witness statements, a desperate mosaic of information that somehow never quite formed a complete picture. Detective Sergeant James Whitehorse, a Cree officer who had requested assignment to the case, stood before this collage of evidence each morning like a man trying to decode an ancient language. The investigation had consumed the small detachment's resources for weeks. Every available officer had been pulled into the search, every lead pursued with the methodical determination that characterized good police work. But the case of Ayanna Sinclair seemed to defy conventional investigative techniques, slipping through their fingers like water through cupped hands. The timeline was frustratingly simple. Ayanna had left her home at approximately 7:30 a.m. on September 14th, walking along Highway 7 toward her high school. Marcus Beardy had seen her at 7:45 a.m., appearing normal and unhurried. Sarah McKinnon had observed her passing the convenience store around the same time. After that, nothing. No witnesses, no trace, no evidence of what had happened in the 2-kilometer stretch between the store and the school. Detective Whitehorse had grown up on a reserve 3 hours north of Peguis, and he understood the particular vulnerability that Indigenous women faced in rural Canada. The statistics were staggering and heartbreaking. Indigenous women were 3 times more likely to experience violence than non-Indigenous women, and far more likely to go missing without adequate investigation or media attention. He had requested this assignment precisely because he feared Ayanna's case might not receive the attention it deserved, might become another file buried under bureaucracy and institutional indifference. The search area had been expanded multiple times. Volunteers from across Manitoba had joined the effort, including members of Bear Clan Patrol, an Indigenous-led community safety organization that had been advocating for missing and murdered Indigenous women for years. They brought with them not only manpower, but also cultural understanding and a deep commitment to ensuring that Ayanna's disappearance would not be forgotten or minimized. Helicopter searches had covered hundreds of square kilometers of wilderness. Dive teams had searched every body of water within a 50-kilometer radius. Cadaver dogs had been brought in from Winnipeg, their handlers methodically working through the dense poplar forests and abandoned farmsteads that dotted the landscape. All of these efforts yielded nothing. No clothing, no personal belongings, no indication of where Ayanna might have gone or what might have happened to her. The interview process had been exhaustive. Every student at the high school had been questioned, their statements cross-referenced and analyzed for inconsistencies. Teachers, staff members, bus drivers, and community members had all provided detailed accounts of their activities that morning. Local registered sex offenders had been located and interviewed, their alibis verified and documented. Transient workers, truck drivers who regularly traveled Highway 7, and anyone with a history of violence against women had been identified and investigated. One name that appeared repeatedly in the investigative files was Officer Ryan Mitchell, a member of the RCMP who was well known in the area and had grown up in nearby Gimli. Mitchell was considered a solid officer with a clean record, someone who had worked cases involving the Indigenous community with what appeared to be genuine concern and professionalism. He had even volunteered for search duties in the days following Ayana's disappearance, spending his off-duty hours walking through the woods and talking to potential witnesses. Mitchell had been among the officers who had taken statements from community members, and his reports were thorough and professionally written. He had interviewed Sarah McKinnon at her convenience store, documenting her recollection of seeing Ayana that morning. He had also spoken with several students who had known Ayana, gathering information about her routines, her relationships, and any concerns she might have expressed in the days before her disappearance. During the investigation, Mitchell's colleagues noted his particular dedication to the case. He worked overtime without compensation, followed up on tips that other officers might have dismissed, and seemed genuinely invested in finding answers for the Sinclair family. His sergeant, Bill Thompson, later recalled that Mitchell had taken the case very personally, which wasn't unusual for officers dealing with cases involving young victims. The physical evidence was virtually non-existent. The stretch of Highway 7 where Ayana had been walking was paved, offering no footprints or tire tracks that might provide clues. The weather in the days following her disappearance had been typical for September in Manitoba. Cool nights, warm days, and occasional rain that would have washed away any trace evidence that might have existed along the roadside. Investigators had paid particular attention to Ayana's personal life, looking for any indication of relationships, conflicts, or concerns that might explain her disappearance. What they found was a young woman whose life was remarkably stable and positive. She had been dating Jamie Constant, a young man from a neighboring reserve, for about 8 months. Their relationship appeared healthy and supportive, with no indication of conflict or controlling behavior. Jamie had been working at a construction site in Winnipeg the morning Ayana disappeared, his alibi verified by multiple co-workers and time-stamped documentation. Ayana's friendships were similarly uncomplicated. She was well liked at school, respected in her community, and known for her maturity and responsibility. Teachers described her as a natural leader who was equally comfortable in academic discussions and cultural activities. She volunteered at the community center, helped organize traditional celebrations, and was actively involved in advocacy work around Indigenous women's rights, a passion that had developed during her junior year when she had researched the disproportionate rates of violence against Indigenous women for a social studies project. The family dynamics appeared stable as well. Linda Sinclair was a single mother who worked as a nurse at the local health center, but Ayana maintained close relationships with extended family members, including her grandmother Margaret and several aunts and uncles who lived nearby. There was no indication of family conflict, financial stress, or any other factor that might have prompted a teenage girl to run away. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation began to shift from active searching to long-term case management. Tips continued to come in, some legitimate, others clearly the product of well-meaning but mistaken witnesses, and a few that seemed to be attempts to mislead the investigation. Each tip was investigated thoroughly, no matter how unlikely it seemed. One call that particularly intrigued investigators came from a trucker who claimed to have seen a young Indigenous woman walking along Highway 7 around the time of Ayana's disappearance. However, he placed the sighting several kilometers north of where other witnesses had seen her, and his description of her clothing didn't match what Ayana had been wearing. When investigators attempted to follow up, they discovered that the caller had provided false contact information. Another tip came from a woman in Winnipeg who claimed to have seen Ayana at a downtown bus station several days after she went missing. This lead was pursued aggressively, with investigators reviewing security footage and interviewing station employees, but nothing corroborated the claim. The woman later admitted that she had been mistaken, having confused Ayana with another young Indigenous woman she had encountered. The most promising lead had come in early October, when a farmer reported finding items of clothing in a field about 15 kilometers from where Ayana was last seen. The clothing included a jacket and jeans that appeared to be the right size for a teenage girl, but forensic examination revealed no connection to Ayana. The clothing belonged to someone else entirely, apparently discarded by transients who had been camping in the area. By November, as Manitoba's legendary winter began to assert itself with the first serious snowfall, the active search for Ayana Sinclair had been suspended. The case remained open, and investigators continued to follow up on any new information that emerged, but the reality was harsh and unforgiving. They had exhausted their leads, their resources, and their conventional investigative approaches. Detective Whitehorse continued to visit the Sinclair family regularly, providing updates even when there was little new to report. These visits were as much about maintaining hope and connection as they were about police work. Linda Sinclair would serve him tea and talk about her daughter's dreams, her plans for college, her desire to become a lawyer who could advocate for Indigenous rights. Margaret, Ayana's grandmother, would show him photographs and share stories about the scarf she had made for her granddaughter, the prayers she had woven into its fibers, the protection she had hoped it would provide. The community of Peguis First Nation rallied around the Sinclair family with the kind of support that Indigenous communities had provided each other for generations. Meals appeared at the family's door without announcement. Elders offered prayers and ceremonies. Young people organized fundraisers to help cover the costs associated with the search efforts. The local radio station ran daily announcements asking for information about Ayana, keeping her name and her story alive in the collective consciousness of the region. But as 2004 drew to a close and winter locked the Manitoba landscape in its icy embrace, the harsh reality could no longer be avoided. Ayana Sinclair had vanished without a trace, joining the ranks of missing Indigenous women whose cases would haunt their families and communities for years to come. Her bedroom remained exactly as she had left it, her grandmother's scarf absent from its usual place draped over her dresser mirror, a reminder of dreams interrupted and questions that seemed destined to remain forever unanswered. Winter arrived early in Manitoba that year, as if the landscape itself was drawing a white curtain over the mystery of Ayana Sinclair's disappearance. By December 2004, snow had erased the familiar contours of Highway 7, transforming the route where she was last seen into an anonymous stretch of white, punctuated only by fence posts and the occasional farm building emerging like dark islands from the frozen prairie. Linda Sinclair learned to navigate a world divided into two distinct realities: the public face she wore during the day, competent nurse, supportive community member, woman managing her grief with dignity, and the private darkness that consumed her nights. She would lie awake listening to the wind howl across the reservation, imagining she could hear her daughter's voice calling from somewhere beyond the storm. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams that were both blessing and torment. Ayana walking through the door with that familiar smile, explaining her absence with some reasonable story that made everything okay again. The first Christmas without Ayana was a season of hollow rituals. Linda went through the motions of celebration because her extended family needed her to, because the community expected some semblance of normalcy. But every tradition felt like an echo of something irretrievably lost. Margaret, Ayana's grandmother, sat in her chair by the window throughout the holiday season, her hands working automatically on beadwork, while her eyes remained fixed on the road outside, watching for a figure that would never appear. "She'll come home," Margaret would murmur, her voice carrying the stubborn faith of someone who had survived too much loss to surrender to despair entirely. The spirits will guide her home. Detective Whitehorse continued to visit the family monthly, then every few months, maintaining the connection even as the active investigation necessarily shifted to other priorities. He had seen this pattern before, the gradual transition from urgent search to long-term missing person case, the way hope slowly crystallized into a different kind of endurance. What struck him about the Sinclair family was their refusal to let Ayana's memory fade, their determination to keep her story alive even as the months stretched into years. By 2006, Ayana would have graduated from high school. Linda attended the ceremony, sitting in the back row as her daughter's classmates crossed the stage to receive diplomas. The principal, Mrs. Henderson, had asked if Linda wanted them to acknowledge Ayana during the ceremony, perhaps present her with an honorary diploma, but Linda had quietly declined. She would have earned it herself, she said simply. She wouldn't have wanted charity, even now. The high school had planted a maple tree in Ayana's honor, near the entrance where students gathered each morning before classes. A small plaque at its base read, "In memory of Ayana Sinclair, 1987-2004, whose spirit continues to inspire us all." Students would sometimes leave flowers there, particularly on September 14th, the anniversary of her disappearance, and during graduation season when her absence felt most acute. Jamie Constant, Ayana's boyfriend, had struggled enormously in the aftermath of her disappearance. He had been questioned extensively by police, his alibi verified multiple times, but the weight of loss and the community's grief had proved almost overwhelming. He had loved Ayana with the intensity that characterizes first love, had planned to propose to her after graduation, had dreamed of a future that included marriage, children, and a life built together on the reservation. Her disappearance had shattered not just his present, but his entire vision of what his life might become. In 2007, Jamie left Manitoba to attend university in British Columbia, needing distance from the memories and the unanswered questions that seemed to permeate every familiar place. Before leaving, he had visited Linda Sinclair to explain his decision and to ask for her understanding. "I love her," he had said, his voice breaking on the present tense that he couldn't bring himself to change to past. "I'll always love her, but I can't breathe here anymore. Everything reminds me of her, and I don't know how to live with that." Linda had embraced him, this young man who had been like a son to her, who had made her daughter happy, who now carried his own burden of survivor's guilt and interrupted dreams. "She would want you to have a good life," Linda had told him. "She would want you to find peace." The case files at the RCMP detachment grew thicker over the years as tips continued to trickle in, each one investigated and documented, even when they led nowhere. There were occasional developments that sparked brief hope, reported sightings in Winnipeg, Toronto, Vancouver, but follow-up investigations invariably proved these to be cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. Officer Ryan Mitchell had been promoted to corporal in 2008, his dedication to community policing and his work on difficult cases like Ayana's earning him recognition within the force. He had eventually been transferred to a detachment in southern Manitoba, but colleagues remembered his commitment to the Sinclair case and his genuine distress at being unable to solve it. Mitchell had kept in touch with the family for several years, calling Linda on the anniversary of Ayana's disappearance to let her know that he hadn't forgotten, that he continued to hope for answers. The Indigenous women's rights movement in Canada gained momentum throughout the 2000s, with Ayana's case becoming one of the stories activists would cite when advocating for better investigation procedures and more resources for missing person cases involving Indigenous women. Linda found herself speaking at conferences and rallies, sharing her daughter's story with audiences across the country. It was painful work, but she felt compelled to ensure that Ayana's disappearance might somehow help prevent other families from experiencing the same loss. "My daughter was going to be a lawyer," Linda would tell these audiences, her voice steady, despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "She was going to fight for our people, for our women. Now I fight for her, and for all the others who can't speak for themselves." Margaret Sinclair passed away in the winter of 2011, 7 years after her granddaughter's disappearance. She died peacefully in her sleep. But Linda knew that her mother had never stopped waiting for Ayana to come home. At the funeral, Linda spoke about how Margaret had continued to weave scarves and blankets throughout her final years, each one carrying prayers for Ayana's safety and return. The family had accumulated dozens of these items, beautiful works of art that served as tangible expressions of hope that never died. The community center where Ayana had taught beadwork to children established an annual scholarship in her name, providing financial assistance to young Indigenous women pursuing higher education. Each year, the scholarship recipient would be asked to participate in a ceremony honoring Ayana's memory and continuing her legacy of bridging traditional culture with modern opportunities. Linda would attend these ceremonies, watching young women who reminded her of her daughter, trying to find comfort in the knowledge that Ayana's dreams lived on in others, even if she couldn't pursue them herself. As the 10th anniversary of Ayana's disappearance approached in 2014, the case remained officially open, but practically dormant. Detective Whitehorse had retired, passing the file to younger officers who reviewed it periodically, but had no new avenues to explore. Technology had advanced significantly since 2004. DNA analysis had improved, digital forensics had become more sophisticated, social media had created new ways for people to leave traces of their presence, but none of these developments had yielded new evidence in Ayana's case. The physical landscape where she had vanished had changed as well. Highway 7 had been widened and repaved. Several of the abandoned farm buildings where searchers had looked for clues had been demolished or renovated. The poplar woods where volunteers had called her name had been partially cleared for agricultural development. It was as if the earth itself was slowly erasing the scene of the mystery, covering the unanswered questions with layers of progress and time. Linda continued to work as a nurse, finding purpose in caring for others, even as her own wound remained unhealed. She had never remarried, had never stopped hoping that someday she might understand what had happened to her daughter. She kept Ayana's room exactly as it had been on September 14, 2004, down to the homework assignments still scattered across the desk and the clothes still hanging in the closet. Friends and family members gently suggested that it might be time to make changes, to allow herself to move forward. But Linda couldn't bring herself to disturb what felt like a shrine to interrupted possibility. "She might come home," Linda would say, echoing her mother's faith. "And when she does, I want everything to be exactly as she left it." The reservation had changed over the decade as well, adapting to new realities while maintaining its cultural identity. Young people like Ayana had grown up and moved away for education or opportunity, returning for visits and ceremonies, but building lives in cities where economic prospects were brighter. The community center had expanded its programming, the health clinic had added services, and the local school had implemented new curricula that emphasized both academic achievement and traditional knowledge. But Ayana's absence remained a constant presence, a reminder of potential unrealized and questions unanswered. Her story had become part of the community's collective memory, passed down to younger generations who hadn't known her personally, but understood that her disappearance represented something larger than individual tragedy. It symbolized the vulnerability that Indigenous women faced, the inadequacy of systems meant to protect them, and the strength of communities that refused to forget their missing daughters. As 2014 gave way to 2015, 15 years had passed since that September morning when Ayanna Sinclair had walked into the mist wearing her grandmother's scarf and vanished from the world. The case had become a cold file, stored in archives with hundreds of other unsolved mysteries, waiting for some unexpected development that might finally provide answers to the questions that had haunted a family, a community, and an entire region for more than a decade. The Manitoba Cold Case Unit operated out of a cramped office in Winnipeg that smelled perpetually of coffee and determination. Detective Sergeant Sarah Chen had been assigned to lead the unit in early 2019, bringing with her 15 years of experience in major crimes and a reputation for the kind of methodical persistence that cold cases demanded. The unit consisted of 4 investigators, a forensic specialist, and a victim services coordinator, a small team tasked with reviewing hundreds of unsolved cases dating back decades. Chen had first encountered Ayanna Sinclair's file during her initial review of Indigenous missing persons cases, a category that represented a disproportionate number of the unit's caseload. The file was thick with investigative reports, witness statements, and search documentation, but it was the photographs that stopped her cold. A 17-year-old girl with intelligent eyes and a warm smile, wearing a traditional scarf that seemed to shimmer with cultural significance and personal history. The decision to reopen the Sinclair case had been influenced by several factors. New DNA analysis techniques had made it possible to extract genetic material from evidence that had been considered unusable in 2004. Advances in digital forensics allowed investigators to examine cell phone records and electronic communications with unprecedented detail. Most importantly, the unit had received additional funding specifically dedicated to cases involving missing and murdered Indigenous women, reflecting growing public awareness and political pressure to address these systemic failures. Detective Constable Michael Beardy, Marcus Beardy's younger brother, had requested assignment to the case review. As a member of the same community where Ayanna had grown up, he brought both cultural understanding and personal investment to the investigation. Michael had been only 14 when Ayanna disappeared, but he remembered her clearly. The older girl who had helped him with math homework at the community center, who had spoken at school assemblies about the importance of education and cultural pride, who had represented everything positive about their generation's potential. The case review began with a complete re-examination of the original evidence. Every witness statement was reread and analyzed for details that might have been overlooked or undervalued. Every piece of physical evidence was catalogued and assessed for potential DNA analysis. Every photograph from the search was digitized and enhanced using modern image processing software that hadn't existed in 2004. Chen was particularly intrigued by the thorough documentation of the original investigation. Detective Whitehorse had been meticulous in his record-keeping, creating a comprehensive timeline and maintaining detailed interview notes that provided insight into the community dynamics and investigative challenges of 2004. What emerged from this review was a picture of a competent investigation that had been hampered not by incompetence or indifference, but by the simple absence of physical evidence and viable leads. One aspect of the case that drew Chen's attention was the involvement of Officer Ryan Mitchell in the original investigation. Mitchell's reports were professionally written and thorough, demonstrating the kind of dedication that characterized good police work. He had volunteered significant personal time to the search efforts, had conducted numerous interviews with witnesses and community members, and had followed up on tips that other officers might have dismissed. His commitment to the case had been noted by his supervisors, and appreciated by the Sinclair family. However, Chen's approach to cold case review included examining not just what investigators had found, but also what they might have missed or overlooked. This meant scrutinizing everyone who had been involved in the original investigation, including the officers themselves. It was standard procedure, not an indication of suspicion, but rather a recognition that new perspectives and analytical tools might reveal connections that hadn't been apparent 15 years earlier. The forensic review yielded some promising developments. Several items of evidence that had been collected in 2004 but deemed unsuitable for DNA analysis could now be processed using advanced techniques. These included cigarette butts found along Highway 7 during the search, hair samples recovered from various locations, and trace evidence that had been preserved but not analyzed due to technological limitations. Chen assigned Detective Constable Jennifer Walsh, a specialist in forensic evidence review, to coordinate with the RCMP's updated laboratory facilities. Walsh had worked dozens of cold cases where technological advances had provided breakthrough evidence, and she approached the Sinclair case with cautious optimism. The problem with cold cases isn't usually the absence of evidence, Walsh explained to the team during one of their weekly review meetings. It's that we didn't know how to read the evidence we had. DNA analysis in 2004 was primitive compared to what we can do now. Touch DNA, degraded samples, mixed profiles, things that were impossible then are routine now. The recanvassing of witnesses proved both illuminating and frustrating. Many of the people who had been interviewed in 2004 were willing to speak with investigators again, but 15 years had inevitably affected their memories. Some details that had seemed vivid in 2004 had faded or become confused with subsequent experiences. Others recalled new details that they insisted had always been part of their memories, but hadn't mentioned during the original investigation. Sarah McKinnon, who had been running the convenience store where Ayanna was last seen, was now in her 70s and suffering from early-stage dementia. Her daughter, who helped manage her affairs, provided what information she could, but Sarah's once clear recollections had become fragmentary and unreliable. This was a common challenge in cold case investigations. The passage of time that allowed for new analytical techniques also eroded the human memories that might provide crucial context. Marcus Beardy, now a successful electrician with a family of his own, met with investigators at the community center, where he and Ayanna had both participated in youth programs. His memory of that September morning remained clear, seeing Ayanna walking along the highway, waving to her from his brother's truck, her scarf bright against the grey sky. But he also provided new context that hadn't seemed relevant in 2004. There was something different about that morning, Marcus told Detective Beardy during their interview. Not about Ayanna. She seemed normal, but there was this tension in the community. People were talking about things that had been happening, girls who felt like they were being watched or followed. It wasn't anything specific enough to report to police, but there was this feeling that something wasn't right. This revelation prompted the cold case team to broaden their investigation beyond the immediate circumstances of Ayanna's disappearance. They began looking for patterns of suspicious activity in the region during the months leading up to September 2004, examining reports of harassment, stalking, or inappropriate behavior that might not have been connected to Ayanna's case at the time. The review of police files from 2004 revealed several incidents that, viewed in isolation, had seemed minor or unrelated. Young Indigenous women had reported feeling followed while walking alone. There had been complaints about a vehicle that was seen repeatedly in areas where women walked or waited for transportation. Several teenage girls had mentioned a man who would slow down when driving past them, sometimes making comments or gestures that made them uncomfortable. These reports had been filed and investigated individually, but no pattern had been identified because they involved different officers, different jurisdictions, and different timeframes. The complaints had also been complicated by the general wariness that many Indigenous community members felt toward police, leading to underreporting and reluctance to provide detailed information about incidents that fell short of clear criminal behavior. Chen's team began mapping these incidents chronologically and geographically, looking for connections that might not have been apparent to investigators working individual cases. What emerged was a pattern of behavior that seemed to escalate in the months before Ayana's disappearance, a progression from observation to approach to more aggressive harassment that culminated in September 2004. The geographical analysis was particularly revealing. The incidents clustered around a specific area of rural Manitoba that included the Peguis First Nation and several neighboring communities. Highway 7, where Ayana had been walking when she disappeared, ran directly through the center of this cluster. The pattern suggested someone with local knowledge who was familiar with the routines and vulnerabilities of young Indigenous women in the area. As the cold case team delved deeper into this pattern analysis, they began focusing on individuals who had been in positions to observe these patterns, who had knowledge of the area, and who might have had opportunities to interact with potential victims without arousing immediate suspicion. This methodical approach led them to examine not just known offenders and suspicious individuals, but also people in positions of authority or trust who would have had legitimate reasons to be present in the communities where the incidents occurred. The investigation took on new urgency in early 2019 when the forensic laboratory reported preliminary results from the DNA analysis of evidence collected 15 years earlier. Several samples that had been deemed unsuitable for testing in 2004 had now yielded partial DNA profiles that could be entered into national databases for comparison. The process was painstaking and time-consuming, requiring careful extraction and amplification of genetic material that had degraded significantly over time. Detective Walsh worked closely with the laboratory technicians, understanding that this might represent their best opportunity for a breakthrough in the case. The samples included trace evidence from various locations along Highway 7, items that had been collected during the massive search effort but had never been successfully analyzed. Each sample represented hours of careful scientific work, and each negative result was a small disappointment in a process that demanded patience and persistence. Chen had also authorized a comprehensive review of everyone who had been involved in the original investigation, not as a matter of suspicion, but as part of standard cold case protocol. This review included background checks, employment histories, and an examination of any subsequent complaints or incidents involving the officers and volunteers who had worked on the case. It was tedious work, but cold cases were often solved through the accumulation of small details that hadn't seemed significant at the time. Linda Sinclair had been cautiously optimistic when the cold case unit contacted her about reopening her daughter's investigation. 15 years of disappointment had taught her to guard her hope carefully, but the prospect of new technology and fresh perspectives brought a familiar flutter of possibility that she had learned to both welcome and fear. "I've never stopped believing that someone knows what happened to her," Linda told Chen during their first meeting. "Someone out there has answers. They've been living with those answers for 15 years, and maybe now they're ready to tell the truth." The meeting took place at the community center, where Ayana had taught beadwork to children, in a conference room decorated with traditional artwork and photographs of community events spanning several decades. Linda had brought a box of items that she thought might be relevant to the investigation: photographs, letters, diary entries that the family had preserved, but hadn't known how to share with the original investigators. Among these items was a journal that Ayanna had kept during her final year of high school, filled with thoughts about her future, reflections on her cultural identity, and observations about the world around her. Chen read through the entries carefully, looking for any indication of fear, concern, or unusual interactions that might provide clues about her disappearance. Most of the entries reflected the normal preoccupations of a teenage girl preparing for adulthood: anxiety about college applications, excitement about graduation, relationship dynamics with friends and family. But there were also entries that revealed Ayanna's growing awareness of the dangers that Indigenous women faced, her involvement in advocacy work, and her determination to use her education to address systemic inequalities. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before her disappearance, caught Chen's attention. "Mrs. Patterson assigned us to research missing and murdered Indigenous women for our social studies project. The numbers are horrible. We disappear at rates that would cause national emergencies if we weren't Indigenous. But what scares me most is how normal it feels, like we're all walking around with this knowledge that we might be next, and we just accept it as part of being who we are. I want to change that. I want our daughters to grow up feeling safe." The entry was prophetic in a way that made Chen's chest tighten with sadness and determination. Here was a young woman who had understood the statistical reality of violence against Indigenous women, who had been planning to dedicate her life to addressing these issues, who had become a victim of the very system she had hoped to change. As winter gave way to spring in 2019, the cold case investigation gained momentum. The pattern analysis had identified several persons of interest who warranted closer examination. The DNA analysis was progressing steadily, with several samples still being processed. Most importantly, the team had developed a comprehensive understanding of the social and geographical context surrounding Ayanna's disappearance that hadn't existed during the original investigation. Chen was particularly intrigued by the reports of suspicious vehicle activity in the months before Ayanna's disappearance. Multiple witnesses had described seeing a dark-colored pickup truck, or SUV, that seemed to appear frequently in areas where young women walked alone. The descriptions were frustratingly vague. Vehicles of this type were common in rural Manitoba, but the consistency of the reports suggested that someone had been actively surveilling potential victims. The cold case team began working with motor vehicle registration databases to identify individuals who had owned dark-colored trucks or SUVs in 2004 and who lived or worked in the areas where the suspicious activity had been reported. This process yielded hundreds of potential matches, each of which required individual investigation and verification. Detective Beardy took primary responsibility for this aspect of the investigation, using his community connections to gather information about vehicle owners and their whereabouts during the relevant time period. It was painstaking work that required sensitivity to community dynamics and an understanding of the historical tension between Indigenous communities and law enforcement. One name that appeared on multiple lists was Ryan Mitchell, who had owned a dark blue Ford F-150 pickup truck in 2004. Mitchell's vehicle matched the general description provided by several witnesses, and his work as an RCMP officer would have given him both the opportunity and the knowledge necessary to observe patterns of behavior in Indigenous communities. However, his involvement in the original investigation and his apparent dedication to finding Ayanna also made him an unlikely suspect. Chen assigned Detective Walsh to conduct a discreet background investigation of Mitchell, not because she suspected him of wrongdoing, but because thoroughness demanded that they examine everyone who had access to information about the case and the community where Ayanna had lived. This investigation would include a review of Mitchell's employment history, any complaints or disciplinary actions, and his whereabouts during the critical time period. As summer approached, 15 years after Ayanna Sinclair had walked into the morning mist and vanished, the cold case investigation was yielding new information and fresh perspectives on an old mystery. The advances in forensic science, the pattern analysis of related incidents and the systematic re-examination of evidence were creating possibilities that hadn't existed in 2004. Chen knew that cold cases were marathons, not sprints, and that breakthrough moments often came after months or years of methodical work. But she also sensed that this case was different, that the combination of new technology, fresh perspectives, and community support might finally provide the answers that Linda Sinclair had been seeking for 15 long years. The investigation was entering a critical phase where scientific analysis would meet human memory, where technological advances would either confirm or contradict the assumptions that had guided the original investigation. Somewhere in the growing collection of evidence, witness statements, and analytical reports lay the truth about what had happened to Ayanna Sinclair on that September morning in 2004. September 14, 2019, marked exactly 15 years since Ayanna Sinclair had vanished into the morning mist along Highway 7. Detective Sergeant Sarah Chen had chosen this date deliberately for what the Cold Case Unit was calling an environmental review, a systematic search of locations that hadn't been thoroughly examined during the original investigation, using ground-penetrating radar and other technologies that hadn't been available in 2004. The landscape had changed significantly over a decade and a half. Several of the abandoned farm buildings that had been searched in 2004 had been demolished, replaced by new agricultural developments, or simply reclaimed by the prairie. Highway 7 itself had been widened and repaved twice, altering the precise geography where Ayanna was last seen. But Chen's team was working from historical aerial photographs and original survey maps, attempting to reconstruct the exact conditions that had existed on the morning of her disappearance. The morning air carried the same September crispness that had characterized the day Ayanna went missing, and Linda Sinclair stood at the edge of the search area, watching teams of investigators and volunteers spread across the familiar landscape. She had been invited to observe the renewed search efforts, though Chen had cautioned her that the likelihood of finding new evidence after 15 years was statistically small. "I need to be here," Linda had said simply. "If there's any chance of finding answers, I need to witness it." The search teams were using a grid pattern that extended far beyond the original search area, incorporating land that had been privately owned in 2004 and therefore inaccessible to investigators at the time. Property ownership had changed hands multiple times over the years, and current landowners had granted permission for the search with the understanding that it might finally bring closure to a case that had haunted the region for 15 years. Detective Constable Michael Beardy was leading one of the search teams, his familiarity with the local terrain and community history making him invaluable for interpreting the landscape and understanding how it might have been used by someone attempting to conceal evidence. The team included volunteers from Bear Clan Patrol, RCMP officers, and forensic specialists equipped with metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and cadaver dogs, whose training had advanced significantly since 2004. The morning progressed slowly, with teams methodically working through sections of prairie, abandoned farmland, and dense poplar groves. Every anomaly was investigated and documented, every piece of debris examined for potential relevance. Most discoveries were predictably mundane: old farm equipment, household refuse, the detritus of rural life accumulated over decades. But the searchers maintained their focus, understanding that breakthrough evidence in cold cases often appeared unremarkable until subjected to proper analysis. It was shortly after noon when the first significant discovery occurred. Sarah Thompson, a volunteer from Bear Clan Patrol who had participated in searches for missing Indigenous women across Manitoba, was working through a dense thicket of wild rose bushes approximately 3 kilometers from where Ayana was last seen. The area was on private property that had been developed for hay production in 2010, requiring the removal of native vegetation and the leveling of several small hills that had characterized the original landscape. Thompson was using a metal detector to examine the root systems of older trees that had been left standing when the land was cleared, operating on the theory that someone hiding evidence might have chosen established landmarks that would be easy to relocate. The detector had been registering the usual collection of false positives: discarded cans, old fence staples, fragments of farm machinery, when it produced a signal that was different in tone and consistency. Careful excavation revealed a small metal object buried approximately 18 inches below the surface, wrapped in what appeared to be deteriorated plastic sheeting. Thompson immediately stopped digging and called for the forensic team, understanding that proper evidence collection techniques were crucial for preserving any information the object might contain. Detective Walsh supervised the careful excavation of what proved to be a jewelry box, tarnished with age but still intact. The plastic wrapping had protected it from moisture and soil contamination, preserving both the metal surface and any potential trace evidence that might be recovered from its interior. The box was photographed in situ, then carefully removed and transported to the mobile forensics unit that had been established at the Search Command Center. Initial examination revealed that the jewelry box contained several items: a pair of silver earrings, a small pendant on a delicate chain, and what appeared to be several strands of long black hair. More significantly, wrapped around the jewelry was a fragment of fabric that displayed the distinctive pattern and coloring of traditional Indigenous weaving: red, brown, and blue threads in a design that was immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the cultural traditions of the region. Linda Sinclair was called to examine the jewelry, her hands trembling as she identified each piece. The earrings were ones she had given Ayana for her 16th birthday. The pendant was a graduation gift from her grandmother Margaret, featuring a small eagle feather design that held special cultural significance. The fabric fragment was unmistakably from the scarf that Margaret had woven for her granddaughter, the scarf that Ayana had been wearing when she disappeared 15 years earlier. "These are hers," Linda whispered, her voice barely audible as she confirmed what the investigators had hoped and feared to discover. "This is all that's left of my daughter." The discovery transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a homicide investigation. The careful burial of personal items, the remote location chosen for concealment, and the deliberate separation of these objects from Ayana herself all suggested the work of someone who had understood the significance of eliminating evidence while perhaps being unable to completely destroy items that carried cultural and emotional meaning. Chen immediately expanded the search area around the burial site, bringing in additional forensic teams and cadaver dogs to conduct a comprehensive examination of the surrounding terrain. If Ayana's personal belongings had been buried here, there was a possibility that other evidence or Ayana herself might be located nearby. The search would continue for several more days, but the jewelry box represented the first concrete evidence of what had happened to her. The forensic analysis of the jewelry box and its contents began immediately, with particular attention paid to potential DNA evidence that might identify who had handled these items after Ayana's disappearance. The metal surfaces, the fabric fragment, and even the soil surrounding the burial site were all collected for analysis, using the most advanced techniques available to law enforcement in 2019. More importantly, the discovery provided investigators with specific evidence that could be compared against potential suspects. Anyone who had been involved in concealing these items would likely have left trace evidence, fingerprints, DNA, fibers from their clothing, that could be detected using modern analytical methods. The plastic wrapping had created a sealed environment that preserved microscopic evidence that might have been destroyed by 15 years of exposure to Manitoba's harsh climate. The news of the discovery spread quickly through the Peguis First Nation and surrounding communities, bringing a mixture of closure and renewed grief to people who had never stopped hoping for answers about Ayana's fate. The community center organized a prayer ceremony to honor her memory and to support the Sinclair family as they processed this confirmation of their worst fears. Elder Mary Sinclair, Ayana's great-aunt, spoke during the ceremony about the significance of the scarf fragment that had been found with the jewelry. "Our ancestors wove protection into those threads," she said, her voice carrying the weight of cultural knowledge passed down through generations. Even in death, those prayers were working to bring her home to us. The investigation now shifted toward identifying who had buried the jewelry box and why they had chosen that particular location. The remote area where it was discovered was not randomly selected. It was accessible by vehicle, but hidden from casual observation, suggesting someone with local knowledge who had planned the concealment carefully. Most significantly, it was land that had been privately owned in 2004, meaning that whoever buried the box had either owned the property, known the owners, or been confident that they could access it without detection. Chen's team began examining property records, identifying everyone who had owned, leased, or worked on the land where the jewelry box was found. They also expanded their investigation to include anyone who might have had legitimate reasons to be in the area during the months following Ayana's disappearance: farmers, hunters, construction workers, or utility maintenance crews who could have accessed remote locations without attracting attention. The pattern analysis that had identified suspicious vehicle activity in 2004 now took on new significance. The burial site was accessible by the same type of dark-colored pickup truck that multiple witnesses had reported seeing in areas where young Indigenous women had been harassed or followed. The location was approximately 15 minutes by vehicle from where Ayana was last seen, suggesting that whoever had taken her had local knowledge and a plan for concealing evidence. As the forensic analysis progressed over the following weeks, investigators began developing a clearer picture of what had happened to Ayana Sinclair. The condition of the jewelry and fabric suggested that these items had been removed from her shortly after her disappearance and buried quickly, possibly within days of September 14, 2004. The careful wrapping and burial indicated someone who understood the importance of preserving evidence while making it extremely difficult to discover. Detective Walsh was coordinating the DNA analysis of trace evidence recovered from the jewelry box, working with laboratories in Winnipeg and Ottawa to extract genetic material from what might be microscopic samples. The process was time-consuming and technically demanding, but advances in forensic science had made it possible to obtain DNA profiles from evidence that would have been useless 15 years earlier. The breakthrough came in late October 2019, when the laboratory reported that they had successfully extracted DNA from trace evidence found inside the jewelry box. The genetic material didn't match Ayana, which was expected, since the goal was to identify who had handled her belongings after her disappearance. Instead, the DNA profile belonged to someone else, someone whose genetic information could now be compared against law enforcement databases and potential suspects. Chen felt the familiar surge of anticipation that accompanied major developments in cold cases. After months of methodical investigation, they finally had physical evidence that could potentially identify Ayana's killer. The DNA profile would be run through national databases, compared against evidence from other unsolved cases, and used to either confirm or eliminate the various persons of interest who had emerged during the investigation. As autumn deepened into winter, 15 years and 2 months after Ayanna Sinclair had walked into the morning mist, wearing her grandmother's scarf, investigators finally had concrete evidence that might lead them to the truth about her disappearance. The discovery of her personal belongings, carefully buried in a remote location, had transformed speculation into certainty, hope into determination, and a cold case into an active homicide investigation. The DNA results were expected within weeks, and Chen knew that they were approaching the moment when months of methodical investigation would either provide the answers that Linda Sinclair had been seeking for 15 years, or lead them down new paths in pursuit of justice for a young woman whose dreams had been cut short by violence, but whose memory continued to inspire a community's fight for truth and accountability. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on November 15, 2019, as Detective Sergeant Sarah Chen was preparing for another day of methodical investigation into the evidence recovered from Ayanna Sinclair's jewelry box. Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the RCMP's Forensic Laboratory in Ottawa was calling with results that would transform the case from investigation to arrest. "We have a match, Doctor," Martinez said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality that forensic scientists maintained when delivering potentially explosive information. "The DNA profile from the trace evidence has been identified through the national database. The individual is Ryan Mitchell, a former RCMP officer who participated in the original investigation." Chen felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that accompanied major breakthroughs, immediately followed by the sobering recognition of what this meant. Ryan Mitchell had not only been involved in investigating Ayanna's disappearance, he had been one of the officers who had worked most closely with the Sinclair family, had volunteered countless hours to the search effort, and had maintained contact with Linda for years after the case went cold. The DNA evidence was conclusive. Advanced analysis had extracted Mitchell's genetic material from several sources within the jewelry box: microscopic skin cells on the metal clasp, saliva traces on the fabric fragment, and hair follicles that had been caught in the jewelry settings. The profile matched Mitchell's DNA with a statistical certainty that exceeded legal requirements for criminal prosecution. Chen immediately contacted Crown prosecutors and her supervising officers, initiating the process that would lead to Mitchell's arrest while ensuring that the evidence was preserved and the case was handled with the meticulous care that such a sensitive situation demanded. The fact that the suspect was a former police officer added layers of complexity to both the legal proceedings and the public relations aspects of the case. Mitchell was located at his current residence in Portage-la-Prairie, where he had been living since his retirement from the RCMP in 2017. He was working as a security consultant and living quietly with his wife of 23 years, apparently having built a stable life that gave no outward indication of the secret he had been carrying for 15 years. The arrest took place at dawn on November 16, 2019, with Chen personally leading the team that approached Mitchell's house. She had insisted on handling this aspect of the investigation herself, understanding the significance of arresting someone who had once worn the same uniform she did, who had sworn the same oath to protect and serve that she took seriously every day of her career. Mitchell answered the door in a bathrobe, his grey hair disheveled from sleep, his face showing the kind of confusion that people display when awakened by unexpected visitors. Chen watched his expression change as he recognized her and understood why she was there, confusion giving way to resignation, as if some part of him had been expecting this moment for 15 years. "Ryan Mitchell, you are under arrest for the murder of Ayanna Sinclair," Chen said, her voice steady and professional as she read him his rights. Mitchell didn't resist, didn't protest his innocence, didn't demand explanations. He simply nodded and asked if he could get dressed before being taken into custody. The news of Mitchell's arrest sent shockwaves through both law enforcement and the Indigenous communities across Manitoba. Here was a police officer who had been trusted with investigating Indigenous women's cases, who had positioned himself as an advocate for justice, who had comforted grieving families while concealing his own role in their trauma. Linda Sinclair received the news from Chen in person in the same community center conference room where they had first met to discuss reopening the case. Linda listened in silence as Chen explained the DNA evidence, the conclusive nature of the match, and what the arrest meant for understanding what had happened to Ayana. "He was in our house," Linda said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He sat at our kitchen table, drank our tea, told us he was doing everything he could to find her. And all that time he knew exactly what had happened to my daughter." The betrayal was perhaps more devastating than the confirmation of Ayana's death. For 15 years, Linda had maintained hope, partly because officers like Mitchell had encouraged that hope, had promised that they would never stop looking, had seemed to share in the family's grief and determination. Learning that one of those officers had been responsible for Ayana's disappearance felt like a fundamental violation of trust that went beyond individual betrayal to institutional failure. The investigation into Mitchell's background revealed a pattern of behavior that had been hidden beneath his professional competence and apparent dedication to his work. Colleagues remembered him as someone who volunteered for assignments involving Indigenous communities, who seemed particularly interested in cases involving young women, who often worked overtime without compensation on investigations that other officers might have handled more routinely. Detective Constable Jennifer Walsh led the comprehensive review of Mitchell's career, examining every case he had worked, every report he had filed, and every interaction he had documented with potential victims. What emerged was a picture of someone who had used his position and authority to gain access to vulnerable individuals while maintaining the facade of professional concern. The review revealed that Mitchell had been present at several incidents involving Indigenous women that had been reported in the months before Ayana's disappearance. He had taken statements from women who reported being followed or harassed, had investigated complaints about suspicious vehicle activity, and had even interviewed some of the same women who had later been identified as potential targets in the pattern analysis conducted by the Cold Case Unit. More disturbingly, the review showed that Mitchell had often volunteered for shifts and assignments that would place him in Indigenous communities, particularly during times when young women might be walking alone or waiting for transportation. His work schedule in September 2004 had given him both the opportunity and the knowledge necessary to encounter Ayana on her way to school. The interrogation of Mitchell took place over several days, with Chen leading a team of experienced investigators who specialized in cases involving law enforcement personnel. Mitchell had initially exercised his right to remain silent, consulting with legal counsel before deciding whether to provide any information about his involvement in Ayana's disappearance. On the third day of his detention, Mitchell's lawyer announced that his client was prepared to make a statement. What followed was a confession that provided answers to questions that had haunted the Sinclair family and the broader community for 15 years, while raising new questions about how such crimes could be prevented and how trust in law enforcement could be restored. Mitchell admitted to encountering Ayana on Highway 7 on the morning of September 14, 2004. He had been driving his personal vehicle, the dark blue Ford pickup truck that had been reported by multiple witnesses, when he saw her walking towards school. Using his authority as a police officer, he had convinced her to accept a ride, claiming that there had been reports of suspicious activity in the area and that it wasn't safe for her to walk alone. "She trusted me because I was a police officer," Mitchell said during his statement, his voice flat and emotionless as he described betraying that trust in the most fundamental way possible. "She got in the truck because she thought I was helping her." What happened next was a crime that combined predatory violence with the calculated abuse of authority. Mitchell had driven Ayanna to a remote location where he sexually assaulted and murdered her, then spent several days disposing of evidence and creating the appearance of a mysterious disappearance. His participation in the subsequent investigation had been both a way to monitor the progress of the case and to ensure that suspicion never fell on him. The burial of Ayanna's jewelry and scarf fragment had been Mitchell's attempt to preserve items that he couldn't bring himself to completely destroy, while ensuring that they would never be found through normal investigative procedures. He had chosen the location specifically because it was on private property that he knew would not be searched in 2004, and because he had access to it through a family connection that wouldn't appear in any official records. Mitchell's confession included details about the disposal of Ayanna's body that led investigators to a second location approximately 50 kilometers from where her personal belongings had been found. The site was in a remote area of Crown land that Mitchell had known from hunting trips, a place where human remains could be concealed for decades without discovery. The recovery of Ayanna's remains took place in early December 2019, nearly 3 months after the discovery of her jewelry box had reignited the investigation. The forensic examination confirmed Mitchell's account of her death while providing additional evidence that would support his prosecution for first-degree murder. Linda Sinclair was present when her daughter's remains were recovered, standing at the edge of another search area as investigators worked with the same methodical care they had shown when finding the jewelry box. The closure was both devastating and necessary. 15 years of not knowing had finally given way to the terrible certainty of understanding exactly what had happened to Ayanna. The community of Peguis First Nation organized ceremonies to honor Ayanna's memory and to begin the process of healing from this revelation of betrayal and violence. Elder Mary Sinclair spoke about the significance of finally being able to lay Ayanna to rest according to traditional practices, while also acknowledging the broader implications of Mitchell's crimes for relationships between Indigenous communities and law enforcement. "We trusted him to protect our daughters," she said during one of these ceremonies. "Instead, he used that trust to harm them. This is why our people have learned to be suspicious of authority, why our women have learned to fear those who claim to protect them." Mitchell's arrest and confession had solved the mystery of Ayanna Sinclair's disappearance, but it had also exposed the vulnerability of Indigenous women to violence from those in positions of power and authority. The case would become a catalyst for broader discussions about police accountability, the investigation of missing Indigenous women, and the systemic changes needed to prevent such betrayals of public trust. As 2019 drew to a close, 15 years after Ayanna had walked into the morning mist wearing her grandmother's scarf, her family finally had the answers they had sought for so long. The truth was more painful than any of them had imagined, but it was also the beginning of a different kind of healing, one that acknowledged the full scope of the loss while working toward a future where such crimes might be prevented and such betrayals of trust could be avoided. The courthouse in Winnipeg had never seen a case quite like this one. By March 2020, the prosecution of Ryan Mitchell for the first-degree murder of Ayanna Sinclair had become a focal point for Indigenous rights activists, police accountability advocates, and legal observers from across Canada. The case represented more than individual justice. It had become a symbol of systemic failures and the potential for accountability when institutions were forced to confront their own complicity in violence against Indigenous women. Crown Prosecutor Amanda Richardson had built her career on complex cases, but the Mitchell prosecution presented unique challenges. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA conclusively linked Mitchell to Ayana's personal belongings. His confession provided detailed knowledge of the crime that only the perpetrator could possess, and the recovery of Ayana's remains had corroborated key elements of his account. However, the case also involved prosecuting a former police officer whose crimes had been enabled by his position of authority and trust. Mitchell had initially pleaded not guilty, despite his confession to investigators. His legal team, led by defense attorney Robert Chang, had argued that the confession was inadmissible due to improper interrogation procedures and that the DNA evidence had been contaminated during the 15 years it spent buried in Manitoba soil. These were standard defense strategies in cases involving former law enforcement personnel, but they seemed particularly cynical given the overwhelming evidence of Mitchell's guilt. The selection of a jury proved extraordinarily difficult. The case had received extensive media coverage throughout Manitoba, and finding jurors who hadn't formed opinions about Mitchell's guilt or innocence required weeks of careful screening. More challenging was identifying jurors who could fairly evaluate evidence against a former police officer, particularly in a case involving an Indigenous victim where questions of institutional bias were central to the broader narrative. Linda Sinclair attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row with family members and community supporters who had traveled from Peguis First Nation to witness this moment of accountability. She wore traditional beadwork jewelry that had been made by women in her community, each piece carrying prayers for justice and healing. Her presence served as a constant reminder of the human cost of Mitchell's crimes and the 15 years of grief that her family had endured. The prosecution's case began with Detective Sergeant Sarah Chen, who methodically walked the jury through the investigation that had led to Mitchell's arrest. Chen's testimony was particularly powerful because she represented the kind of police work that should have been conducted in 2004, thorough, unbiased, and focused on finding truth rather than protecting institutional interests. The original investigation was compromised from the beginning, Chen testified, her voice clear and professional as she described the evidence. The person responsible for Ayana Sinclair's murder was also one of the people investigating her disappearance. He used his position to misdirect the investigation to ensure that evidence pointing toward him was never collected or analyzed, and to maintain the trust of the victim's family while concealing his own guilt. The DNA evidence was presented through testimony from Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the forensic scientist who had made the conclusive identification. Martinez explained to the jury how advances in DNA analysis had made it possible to extract genetic material from evidence that would have been considered unusable in 2004, and how the laboratory had confirmed Mitchell's identity through multiple independent tests. The defense attempted to challenge the DNA evidence by questioning the chain of custody and the possibility of contamination, but Martinez's testimony was thorough and unshakable. The genetic material had been preserved by the plastic wrapping and the burial conditions, and the laboratory procedures had followed protocols designed specifically to prevent contamination and ensure reliability. Perhaps the most devastating testimony came from Mitchell himself. The prosecution played recordings of his confession, allowing the jury to hear in his own words how he had used his authority as a police officer to gain Ayana's trust, how he had planned and executed her murder, and how he had spent 15 years deceiving her family and community while participating in the investigation of his own crime. The confession included details that only the perpetrator could have known. The specific location where Ayana's body had been concealed, the method used to bury her personal belongings, and the timeline of events that had allowed him to return to work and participate in the search efforts without arousing suspicion. Most chillingly, Mitchell had described his thought process during the investigation, explaining how he had used his inside knowledge to ensure that certain evidence was never collected and certain leads were never pursued. The defense's primary strategy was to argue that Mitchell's confession had been coerced and that his client had been suffering from mental health issues that had affected his judgment during the interrogation. Chang called several witnesses who testified about Mitchell's psychological state in the months following his arrest, suggesting that he had been overwhelmed by guilt and shame in ways that had made him vulnerable to making false admissions. This strategy proved ineffective against the overwhelming physical evidence. The recovery of Ayana's remains from the exact location described in Mitchell's confession, combined with forensic evidence that corroborated his account of the crime, made it impossible to argue that his statement had been fabricated or coerced. The prosecution also presented evidence about Mitchell's pattern of behavior in the years leading up to Ayana's murder. Detective Walsh testified about her review of cases Mitchell had worked, identifying instances where he had used his position to gain access to vulnerable Indigenous women, where he had volunteered for assignments that placed him in situations where such crimes might occur, and where his behavior had demonstrated a predatory pattern that had been hidden beneath his professional competence. Several Indigenous women who had encountered Mitchell during his career were called to testify about interactions that, viewed in isolation, had seemed like normal police work, but which took on sinister significance in light of his confession. These women described being questioned extensively about their personal lives, being asked to accompany Mitchell to secondary locations for interviews, and experiencing behavior that had made them uncomfortable, but which they had attributed to normal police procedures. One witness, Marie Brass, testified about an encounter with Mitchell in 2003, approximately 1 year before Ayana's murder. Marie had reported being followed by a suspicious vehicle, and Mitchell had responded to take her statement. During the interview, he had asked detailed questions about her daily routines, her work schedule, and the routes she used when walking alone. At the time, Marie had assumed these questions were part of a thorough investigation, but Mitchell's arrest had caused her to reconsider the nature of his interest. "I thought he was trying to help me," Marie testified, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of recounting the experience. "Now I realize he was gathering information that could have been used to hurt me or other women like me." The community impact testimony provided the jury with a broader understanding of how Mitchell's crimes had affected not just the Sinclair family, but the entire region. Elder Mary Sinclair spoke about the breakdown of trust between Indigenous communities and law enforcement, the fear that Mitchell's crimes had created among Indigenous women, and the cultural significance of Ayana's death for a community that had already experienced generations of violence and loss. "When we learned that a police officer had killed our daughter, it confirmed our worst fears about the system that claims to protect us," Mary testified. "Our women already knew they were vulnerable, but learning that those who were supposed to investigate crimes against us were sometimes the ones committing those crimes, that knowledge has changed how we view authority, how we teach our daughters to navigate the world." Linda Sinclair's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. She spoke about Ayana's dreams and aspirations, her commitment to her community, and her plans to use her education to address the very problems that had ultimately led to her death. Linda also described the 15 years of not knowing, the hope and despair that had characterized her family's experience, and the particular betrayal of learning that someone they had trusted had been responsible for their grief. "He sat in my kitchen," Linda told the jury, her voice breaking as she recalled Mitchell's visits to their home during the investigation. "He drank tea with me and promised that he would never stop looking for my daughter. He attended prayer ceremonies for her. He comforted me when I cried. He made me believe that there were good people working to find answers. All that time he knew exactly what had happened to Ayana, because he was the one who had killed her." The defense's closing argument attempted to portray Mitchell as someone who had been overwhelmed by guilt and mental illness, whose confession represented an attempt to atone for mistakes rather than an accurate account of premeditated murder. Chang argued that the prosecution had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Mitchell had planned Ayana's death, and that the charges should be reduced to manslaughter based on his client's psychological state. Crown Prosecutor Richardson's closing argument methodically demolished the defense's contentions, walking the jury through the evidence that demonstrated planning, predatory behavior, and deliberate abuse of authority. She emphasized that Mitchell's position as a police officer had made his crimes particularly heinous, and that his participation in the investigation represented a continuing betrayal of his oath and the public trust. "This was not a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment," Richardson told the jury, her voice carrying the weight of 15 years of delayed justice. "This was a calculated predator who used his badge, his authority, and the trust that our society places in law enforcement to prey upon a vulnerable young woman. He planned her murder, he executed it with cold deliberation, and then he spent 15 years deceiving her family and community while actively working to ensure that his crimes would never be discovered." Richardson pointed to the evidence of Mitchell's participation in the original investigation, his careful burial of Ayana's personal belongings, and his systematic efforts to misdirect attention away from himself. She argued that these actions demonstrated a level of planning and calculation that clearly supported the first-degree murder charge. "Ryan Mitchell didn't just kill Ayana Sinclair," Richardson continued. "He killed her twice, once when he took her life, and again every day for 15 years when he allowed her family to hope she might still be alive, when he participated in searches for a body he had hidden, when he comforted a mother whose grief he had caused." The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning their verdict. The courtroom was packed with members of the Sinclair family, representatives from Indigenous communities across Manitoba, law enforcement officers, and media representatives who understood the historical significance of the moment. The silence was absolute as the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict. "On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Ayana Sinclair, we find the defendant, Ryan Mitchell, guilty." The words hung in the air for a moment before the courtroom erupted in a mixture of sobs, prayers, and quiet expressions of relief. Linda Sinclair buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with 15 years of accumulated grief and the overwhelming recognition that justice had finally been served. Family members embraced, community supporters offered prayers, and even hardened court officers seemed moved by the emotional release that accompanied this long-awaited accountability. Mitchell showed no visible reaction to the verdict, sitting motionless at the defense table, as his lawyers conferred about potential appeals. His wife, who had attended portions of the trial, had stopped coming after the prosecution presented his confession, unable to reconcile the man she had lived with for decades with the predator whose crimes had been laid bare in court. Justice Margaret Thompson scheduled sentencing for the following month, allowing time for victim impact statements and for the preparation of materials that would help her determine the appropriate punishment for crimes that had devastated a family and traumatized an entire community. The verdict sent ripples throughout Canada's law enforcement community, raising uncomfortable questions about internal oversight, accountability mechanisms, and the particular vulnerability of Indigenous women to violence from those in positions of authority. Several provincial police forces announced reviews of their procedures for investigating cases involving Indigenous victims, while Indigenous advocacy organizations called for broader systemic reforms. Detective Sergeant Chen, who had led the cold case investigation that finally brought Mitchell to justice, spoke to reporters outside the courthouse about the significance of the verdict. This case demonstrates that no one is above the law, regardless of their position or authority, she said. But it also shows us how much work we still have to do to earn and maintain the trust of communities that have been failed by the system for too long. As news of the verdict spread throughout Manitoba and across Canada, it sparked conversations about police accountability, the investigation of crimes against Indigenous women, and the long-term work needed to address systemic failures that had enabled Mitchell's crimes. The case had become more than individual justice. It had become a catalyst for broader change and a symbol of the possibility for accountability, even in cases where institutional power had been abused. For Linda Sinclair and her family, the verdict provided a form of closure that they had sought for 15 years. It didn't bring Ayana back, didn't erase the pain of her loss, and didn't fully heal the wounds that Mitchell's betrayal had created. But it did confirm that their daughter's life had mattered, that justice was possible even when it was delayed, and that truth could emerge even when it had been deliberately concealed by those in positions of trust and authority. The trial phase of this long journey was complete, but the work of healing, reform, and ensuring that such crimes could be prevented in the future was just beginning. Ayana Sinclair's legacy would live on not just in the justice that had been achieved, but in the changes that her case might inspire to protect other Indigenous women and to restore trust between law enforcement and the communities they are sworn to serve. The sentencing hearing took place on a crystalline April morning in 2020, with sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the Winnipeg courthouse and illuminating the faces of the dozens of people who had gathered to witness the final chapter of a case that had consumed 15 years and changed countless lives. Justice Margaret Thompson had requested additional time to review the extensive victim impact statements and to consider the broader implications of a case that extended far beyond individual criminal justice to questions of institutional accountability and systemic reform. Linda Sinclair had spent weeks preparing her victim impact statement, working with community elders and victim services coordinators to find words that could adequately express the magnitude of her family's loss and the particular betrayal they had experienced. She stood at the podium wearing the same traditional beadwork jewelry she had worn throughout the trial, her voice steady, despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her as she addressed both the court and the man who had murdered her daughter. "Your Honor, Ryan Mitchell didn't just take my daughter's life," Linda began, her words carrying the weight of 15 years of grief and the dignity that had sustained her through the longest journey any parent should have to endure. "He took her future, her dreams of becoming a lawyer who would fight for Indigenous women. He took our hope, our trust, and our faith in the system that was supposed to protect us. For 15 years he sat in my kitchen, attended our prayer ceremonies, and promised to help us find Ayana, all while knowing exactly what had happened to her because he was the one who had killed her." Linda spoke about the ripple effects of Mitchell's crimes, describing how Ayana's disappearance had affected her younger cousins, who had grown up understanding that even the most promising and protected among them could simply vanish without explanation. She talked about the community's loss of a young leader who had planned to bridge traditional knowledge with modern education, and about the broader impact on Indigenous women's trust in law enforcement. "Ayana believed in justice," Linda continued, her voice growing stronger as she channeled her daughter's memory into her words. "She was researching missing and murdered Indigenous women for a school project because she wanted to be part of the solution. She never knew that the very system she hoped to reform would be the source of her own destruction. But today, finally, that system is providing the justice she would have fought for. Justice for herself and for all the Indigenous women whose cases have been ignored or mishandled. Elder Mary Sinclair also addressed the court, speaking in Ojibwe before providing an English translation that described the cultural significance of Ayana's death and the traditional understanding of justice that required not just punishment, but acknowledgement of harm and commitment to preventing its recurrence. She spoke about the prayers that had been woven into Ayana's scarf, the protection that those prayers had provided, even in death, by eventually leading investigators to the truth, and the responsibility that the justice system now bore to honor those prayers through meaningful change. Jamie Constant, Ayana's former boyfriend who had returned from British Columbia specifically for the sentencing, provided testimony about the personal cost of Mitchell's crimes for everyone who had loved Ayana. He described the survivor's guilt that had plagued him for years, the relationships he had been unable to form because of his unresolved grief, and the slow process of healing that had begun only when Mitchell's arrest finally provided answers to questions that had haunted him for 15 years. "I loved her," Jamie said simply, his voice breaking as he addressed the court. "I was going to propose to her after graduation. I had our whole life planned out, marriage, children, building something beautiful together on the reservation. When she disappeared, I felt like I had failed to protect her, like I should have been walking with her that morning. Learning that a police officer was responsible, that someone who was supposed to protect her had betrayed that trust, it explained why all our searching and hoping had been futile. We were trusting the system to find answers when the system itself was hiding the truth." The prosecution had prepared extensive documentation of Mitchell's crimes and their impact, including expert testimony about the particular vulnerability of Indigenous women to violence and the ways in which Mitchell's position as a law enforcement officer had enabled and concealed his predatory behavior. The materials painted a picture of systematic abuse of authority that had culminated in murder, but had been preceded by years of behavior that should have raised concerns among his colleagues and supervisors. Dr. Sarah Wilson, a criminologist who specialized in cases involving law enforcement misconduct, testified about the broader implications of Mitchell's crimes for public trust in police institutions. She explained how cases like this one undermined the legitimacy of law enforcement in Indigenous communities that already had historical reasons to be suspicious of authority, and how the failure to detect Mitchell's predatory behavior earlier represented a systemic failure that required comprehensive reform. When police officers commit crimes against the communities they're sworn to protect, the damage extends far beyond individual victims, Dr. Wilson testified. It creates a crisis of legitimacy that can take generations to repair, particularly in communities that have already experienced historical trauma from government institutions. Mitchell's defense team had prepared their own materials for sentencing, arguing for a sentence that reflected their client's previous service as a police officer and his cooperation with investigators after his arrest. They presented character references from colleagues who had worked with Mitchell before his crimes came to light, emphasizing his apparent dedication to his work and his family. However, these arguments carried little weight against the overwhelming evidence of Mitchell's betrayal of his oath and the devastating impact of his crimes on the Sinclair family and the broader community. His confession had revealed not just the murder itself, but the calculated deception that had followed, including his manipulation of the investigation and his psychological torment of Ayana's family through 15 years of false hope. Justice Thompson's sentencing decision reflected both the legal requirements for first-degree murder and the particular aggravating factors that characterized Mitchell's crimes. She noted that his position as a law enforcement officer had made his crimes particularly egregious, that his participation in the investigation represented a continuing betrayal of public trust, and that the impact on Indigenous communities required recognition in determining an appropriate sentence. Ryan Mitchell was sworn to protect and serve the public, Justice Thompson said as she delivered her sentence. Instead, he used his position, his authority, and the trust that our society places in law enforcement to commit the most serious crime in our legal system. He then compounded that crime by participating in the investigation of his own actions, deceiving the victim's family, and actively working to ensure that justice would never be served. Justice Thompson sentenced Mitchell to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years, the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder in Canada. However, she also recommended that Mitchell never be granted parole, noting that his crimes represented such a fundamental betrayal of public trust that he could never again be safely released into society. The sentence I am imposing today cannot bring back Ayanna Sinclair, Justice Thompson continued. It cannot undo the 15 years of grief that her family has endured, and it cannot repair the damage that these crimes have done to relationships between law enforcement and Indigenous communities. But it does represent our society's recognition that these crimes demand the most serious consequences available under our law. The sentencing marked the end of the legal proceedings, but it also represented the beginning of a broader conversation about police accountability and the protection of Indigenous women. Several provinces announced reforms to their missing person investigation procedures, with particular attention to ensuring that cases involving Indigenous victims received appropriate resources and oversight. The RCMP conducted an internal review of Mitchell's career, examining whether there had been warning signs that had been missed or ignored by his supervisors. The review identified several instances where Mitchell's behavior had raised concerns among colleagues, but where those concerns had not been formally reported or investigated. This led to new protocols for reporting and investigating potential misconduct, particularly in cases involving officers who worked with vulnerable populations. Linda Sinclair used the media attention surrounding the case to advocate for broader changes in how missing person cases were investigated and how Indigenous communities were served by law enforcement. She established the Ayanna Sinclair Foundation, which provided support for families of missing Indigenous women and advocated for policy changes that might prevent similar crimes. "My daughter wanted to be a lawyer so she could fight for our people," Linda said during the press conference announcing the foundation. "She can't do that work herself anymore, but we can do it in her memory. We can make sure that other families don't have to go through what we've been through, and we can work to rebuild trust between our communities and the institutions that are supposed to protect us." The Peguis First Nation organized a celebration of life ceremony for Ayanna, finally able to honor her memory with the traditional practices that acknowledge death and celebrate the continuation of spirit. The ceremony took place at the community center, where Ayanna had taught beadwork to children, with hundreds of people attending to share memories, offer prayers, and commit to continuing the work that she had planned to do. Margaret Sinclair's loom, which had been silent since her death in 2011, was brought out for the ceremony, and community women worked together to complete a blanket that had been started but never finished. The blanket would be displayed at the community center as a reminder of Ayanna's legacy and the cultural traditions that she had embodied. Detective Sergeant Chen attended the ceremony, along with several other officers who had worked on the cold case investigation. Their presence represented an attempt to begin rebuilding relationships between law enforcement and the Indigenous community, recognizing that Mitchell's crimes had damaged trust that would take years to repair. As the ceremony concluded with traditional songs and prayers, Linda Sinclair stood holding a photograph of her daughter, the same school picture that had been displayed on missing person posters for 15 years. But now, instead of representing a question without an answer, the photograph served as a reminder of a life that had mattered, a case that had been solved, and a legacy that would continue through the work of those who remembered Ayana's dreams and were committed to making them reality. The sun was setting over Lake Winnipeg as the ceremony ended, casting the same golden light that had illuminated that September morning in 2004 when Ayana had walked into the mist wearing her grandmother's scarf. The mystery that had haunted a community for 15 years had finally been solved, but the work of healing and reform that her case had inspired was just beginning. If stories like Ayana's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart.